Okay, here we go again. I have an unction tonight to continue this next installment of reviewing JD. See, I messed myself up last night. Last time I did this, doing that, and it's just weird how the power of suggestion works, in your head. I saw JD somewhere, and I know his name's JR Bronger. I've known him for 20 years, but more than that probably. Anyway, just messed me up. So I'm going to continue doing this tonight. So I thought you might find this interesting. If you have comments, we'd certainly love to hear from you. And want to say hey to those who are joining us. Dusty Rose, good to have you with us. Absolutely fantastic. Check my feeds here and see what we got going and how things look. Yeah, that's looking good. Okay, I think we're good to go. Now, last night we left off at on the video. So let me bring this up here. Okay, I think this will do it. So last night we left off this portion of the video. So I'm going to pick up here. I'm going to try to contain myself. Okay, I just want you to know that this just fires me up. So we're going to pick up here. I'm not going to go over anything. If you want to see more, go to YouTube at Restoration Movement 2.0, and there you can see a playlist of this. So there'll be one until we get all of them done. I don't know how many that will be, but until we can do that. So I'm going to pick up here where I left off in the last video. We're going to try to stay around an hour again on this. So here we go. Just let's take a listen, and I'll hit the pause button, and we will review this as we go.
Let me explain to you, by using a quotation from Max King, what this
Max King again
teaches. I kind of looked at it and sort of point by point by point. But let's kind of look at this from the standpoint of a chart that I put together. Max King said, this means that during the eschaton, that's the climax of history, what that word means, the believers lived in a tension of experienced and anticipated eschatology between the already and the not yet. I began to wonder if I could hear the tune to the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
You're not in, you're not out. You're in the Twilight Zone. Just between the already and the not yet.
Okay. Now, he just made fun of a biblical concept. This idea of the already but the not yet, the prolepsis. Let me give you an idea of what the prolepsis is. It's like saying dead man walking, right? So, the fact of the matter is, we know that... Okay, but before I do this, let's listen a little bit more here. So this is what they do. They have to make fun of. They just have to make fun of things. Now, don't get me wrong. I have my times, and I think that levity can help, but this is their approach to refuting us. Is making fun of us. So I don't know. Let's just continue here.
They were already in the kingdom of Christ. Can't deny that because of Colossians 1:13. But they were still waiting for the coming of the kingdom of God. Now that shows you that they take the difference between the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of God, which there is no difference. Well, what this means, let me sort of illustrate what this means. The eschaton would have been the 40 years of the messianic reign of the kingdom of Christ. That is after the crucifixion of Christ until the destruction of Jerusalem. In 70 A.D., Jerusalem was destroyed. They say this is the second coming. The kingdom of God, not the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of God in all its full glory and power was established. At that time, the resurrection occurred, the final judgment, the end of the world, all happened. Now that's basically in chart form this doctrine. So what this means is that the earth is going to continue eternally. Not going to be burned up, not going to be destroyed, not going to end. It also means that since that time, we're all living in the resurrection. We are all alive today after the return of Christ. This means there's going to be no future resurrection. There's going to be no future judgment. And that when one dies, his soul is not going to go to Hades, he's going to go straight to heaven. That there's no such place as Hades that one goes to today. Now, what I want to do now is point out some consequences.
Okay, so let me stop it right here. So let's go back to this idea of the prolepsis, or the, how do we put this? This idea of the already but the not yet. Let me show you a passage here in Romans chapter 8. So this is Romans chapter 8. Now, actually, yeah, we'll just do this. Okay, so in Romans chapter 8, if you notice here in verse 24, okay, so starting in verse 24, it says, "For in hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he already sees? If we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance we wait eagerly for it." So there's this concept here of this that which is coming, and it's the things that have been promised. Okay, for example, so you've got Abraham and the promise of Abraham, and Abraham was promised this nation to become a great nation. This is in Genesis chapter 12. So it was said of Abraham that he had become a great nation already. But it hadn't happened yet. As a matter of fact, he hadn't even had a son. But it was as good as done. And that's the thing that, without going into this great exegesis over all of this, that's the point that we're making about this. So you've got this thing that has happened. It's as good as done, but it's in the time of the first century church, of course. Okay, this is what I'm trying to get at here at this writing. When it was written, it was in process. Now, you had the kingdom was growing. It was starting as a mustard seed, and it grows into a great plant. The kingdom was not something that was as good as that was complete on day one with there at Pentecost, and however really you want to put this, it really doesn't matter. It wasn't mature, and it had to grow. It had to mature according to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew 13. This idea of the kingdom. Look at the kingdom. The kingdom was heaven. It was being opened incrementally. It wasn't something that the covering was just ripped off of it all at once, and then it was being opened incrementally. The resurrection was taking place incrementally. All of these things were starting at a point here with Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection, with the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, and then growing into maturity at its finality in the coming of the Lord, which would be the maturity of the kingdom. But it was the same as taking place. Let me show you another illustration of this in 2 Timothy. This is kind of part of this, and I think Paul uses this concept, and he explains this idea of prolepsis, right? So in 2 Timothy, let me turn over here. It's too hard to talk and turn to the Bible at the same time. So in 2 Timothy chapter 4, look at verse 6. He says, "I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness with the Lord, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. So in here in 2 Timothy chapter 4, there verse 6, 7, and 8, he says, this crown of righteousness is laid up for me. It's there waiting on me. But did he have it already? See, notice what he says here in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 23. He says, well, verse 21, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which to choose, but I am hard-pressed from both directions, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. So here he says, I want to die, depart, and be with Christ. Okay, he knows this is where he's going. He knows that this is the end game. But when he dies, if he dies before the coming of the Lord, then he has to go to Sheol, to the Hadean realm, which is what JR mentions here just a moment ago. And hi, Michael, good to see you. And he mentions this just a moment ago in there. So Paul knew that this crown of righteousness was laid up for him in 2 Timothy chapter 4. But did he not know that it was waiting? Or that he had it? Or did he have it in Philippians chapter 1 verse 23? So it's that already but not yet. Okay, get it? So that's kind of the idea. Sheol, matter of fact, Sheol itself was a prolepsis. It's kind of the embodiment of prolepsis. Okay, so let's talk about this. So Sheol is where the soul would go to await the coming of the Lord. Now we know that the Lord has come already. But he hadn't at the time of the writing of the New Testament. So they had to wait in Sheol until the Lord comes. So, Sheol itself is the prolepsis, essentially. It's as good as done, but you just had to wait. So you go to Sheol and you know that you're saved or that you've been acceptable because you were there in paradise or the bosom of Abraham or the comfort of Abraham. So you knew it, but it was as good as done, but you still had to wait for it. Now, there's another passage that I want you to consider as well. This is Romans chapter 4. In Romans chapter 4, listen to, just give me a second here. So this is verse 13. So there was this, and I mentioned this a minute ago, but let's elaborate on this a little bit. Verse 13, for the promise to Abraham, or to his descendants, that he would be heir of the world was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void, and the promise nullified. So here a promise was made to Abraham. Was that promise as good as done? Yes, but did it have to go through the process? Absolutely. So this is the idea of prolepsis, or the already but not yet, or the it's as good as done kind of biblical concept. So that was verse 13, right? And 14. But look at verse 15. Again, this is Romans 4. For the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, there is also no violation. For this reason, it is by faith, in order that we may be in accordance with grace, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all descendants. Okay? So this promise was guaranteed. Now, you might buy a warranty, for example, on a car that you buy, but there's no guarantee they're going to fix that. There's a probability they will, but they'll try to get out of it if they can. You know, they don't want to spend the money. It's how they make their money, the warranty companies. If you have a guarantee on something, that's a little better than a warranty, because the guarantee is supposed to be something that's certain. Of course, with men, you know how that works. But with God, who's backing that? This isn't some insurance company backing the guarantee. This is God. This is Yahweh. And he made the guarantee. Let me read this again. He made the guarantee that these things would take place, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all the descendants, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. So this was a guarantee to those who followed the law, but also those who follow faith. Okay, the law of Moses, Old Covenant. The law of faith, the New Covenant. Okay, so that's the idea. In verse 17, as it is written, a father of many nations have I made you. So when the guarantee, the promise was made to Abraham, he said, I've made you a father of many nations, but yet it hadn't happened. He didn't even have a child. Continuing on. In the presence of him whom he believed, even God who gives life to the dead. Now notice this. This is the New American Standard. And calls into being that which does not exist. Now, if you look at the footnote, it's literally calls things which do not yet exist as existing. That's the prolepsis. That's what the prolepsis is. This is the perfect explanation of what the prolepsis is. Now, he made fun of that. And he said, well, I'm waiting for the what do you call it? The Twilight Zone theme to start playing. It just goes to show that he doesn't understand the prolepsis. Things had to follow their course and reach their end. Jesus actually said that he was the end, or the telos, or the goal. He's the end goal. This is the end game. So here he is. He's the goal. He's the end game. And guess what? In the first century, he said, I'm going to come in your lifetime. All of these things are going to be accomplished in your lifetime. I think it's actually in, maybe it's Romans 10. Yeah, Romans 10 in chapter 4 says, for Christ is the end of the law. He's the telos, the end goal, okay, of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. And then, check this out. Maybe you haven't made this connection or not, I don't know. But if you look here in the book of James, chapter 5. Let me get over here. So, James chapter 5. Now, this is backwards. I got to go back a little further back here. So, James 5:17 is what we're looking for. Nope. He says, that's not what I'm looking for. Oh, I hate it when I do this. Anyway, the end of all things is near. How do you get around that? How do you get it? When he said the end of all things is near, how do you get around that? I don't know. I don't know how you can get around that. Actually, I think that's 1 Peter. Oh, it's too late. My brain's drawing a blank. I get stuck here. Anyway, we'll just put that together. You know where the passage is at. That's in James. The end of all things is near. So how do you get around that? Yeah, there it is. James 4. The coming of the Lord is near. He says there in verse 8, the end of all things is near. So it'll come to me in a minute. I can't look at all over for something and try to find it anyway. So that's embarrassing sometimes. But that's just how my brain works. Okay, so that's the prolepsis. Let's go on here and listen to a little more. So, by the way, the point I was making that the end of all things is near is Jesus, or the telos, or the end, was near. Okay, so let's continue listening here as he talks about the consequences. Now, here again, this is the standard play in the playbook of those who are opposed to the truth that Jesus has already returned. And that is to say, well, here's all the consequences. Well, I got all kinds of consequences that we can talk about of the futurist view if we really want to. But let's listen to what he has to say.
Of this doctrine. And there are many, but I'm just going to list a few. Do not be deceived into believing that this is just a matter of opinion. It is not simply a matter of judgment. It is a matter of doctrine. Somebody, whether it's the AD70 advocates or people like us, are teaching another gospel. Now that was again highlighted in a conversation that I had with the same man that I referenced earlier. I said, well, will you agree that one of us, either you or
Okay, well, let me let him finish the sentence
me,
here.
would be teaching another gospel as per Galatians 1, 6 through 9? He said yes. So they recognize that somebody is teaching another gospel. So why in the world would we be willing to say, if they're advocating this, that this can be placed in the realm of judgment? It cannot. Somebody is teaching another gospel, and Paul says he who does so is to be accursed or viewed as an anathema.
Okay, so let's talk about this first point he makes here of the consequences. He says it cannot be simply a matter of opinion. Now, I have to agree with that, actually. And you may not be able to see him on your screen there, but he is there. He's just kind of in the dark. There to my right, to the right of that screen, as you're facing the screen. So it cannot be simply a matter of opinion. Now, here's the reason it can't be a matter of opinion about the coming of the Lord. Now, remember, Revelation 19:10. Oh, by the way, that was 1 Peter 4:7. I knew that's what it was. You know, wires cross. And so here's how a mechanic thinks about what just happened to me. You get these old spark plug wires, and they get too close to each other, and they start arcing on each other, and it creates a miss. So that's what happens with me sometimes. But anyway, so that was 1 Peter 4:7. The end of all things is near. The end was the telos, or is the goal, or it was Jesus. It's all the same thing. And they said it was near in the first century. That is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of inspiration. Now, if you want to say that, well, I'm a futurist, and I believe that Jesus Christ is coming back in the future, and that's what the first century brethren taught, you're just totally wrong. That is not what they taught at all. We just showed that through 1 Peter 4, verse 7. Romans 10 and verse 4. Jesus is the end of the law, the telos of the law. The telos was near, 1 Peter 4 and verse 7. Now, let's examine how he takes Galatians 1, 6 through 9 out of context. So let's turn over here to Galatians. And this is just very typical. It's so easy to proof text. And that's exactly what these brethren find themselves doing. JR simply, he refuses to debate. Trent brought up a point here just a minute ago. Where did I see this? I was going to quote it, but that's okay. That's all right. But Trent brought up a point that years ago, JR had a radio program. This was in, I'm going to say the late 90s maybe. And he said, I will debate any preterist. Just call me. And I had forgotten about this, so I'm glad Trent remembered this. And David Curtis tried to get in contact with him and said, I'm a preterist. I'll debate you. And he never, ever would do it. So I'm going to say that JR still, 20 years later, is going to refuse to debate me, his brother in Christ, baptized just like him, preached in the same church as him for many years. Matter of fact, I still preach in the Church of Christ. I don't know about JR, but he will not debate this issue. I can guarantee you that. But we're still going to put the invitation out there. As a matter of fact, I probably should just mail him one. I have a text. I send him a text. I'll send him a message. I'll put it in the mail, and here it is online. So here it is. We need to debate this, brother, because you called me a coward. You had no problems calling me a coward. Of course, this happens a lot. You had no problems calling me a coward. We're going to see who the coward is and how often you say, well, no, it's been debated. No, it hasn't. and I'm going to do everything I can possibly do to reach every person that you have influence over, to illustrate to them that you are the one who is running from defending your position. So anyway, let's keep going on with this. Galatians 1, starting here in verse 6. I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. What was this different gospel? This was that apostasy that was taking place. It was the apostasy, the same apostasy that Paul warned Timothy about, that was going to take place, that he warned the Thessalonians about. Just 4 or 5 years earlier, he had told the Thessalonians, there will come this great apostasy that's going to take place before the coming of the Lord. That's 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The first couple of verses, well, actually, the entire chapter, the entire book, both of those books. Okay, so that's the context. But 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 and 2, talks about this resurrection that's going to take place at the coming of the Lord, and that there are people who are deceiving you. That was the apostasy about resurrection. It's the same apostasy that we talk about in video number 1 of this series, and that was they were teaching erroneously, Hymenaeus and Philetus, so go back and listen to that. They were teaching erroneously about the resurrection. Now, the issue with that is that he is perpetuating this lie and this great apostasy. So that was what they were so soon removed from. Now listen to this, okay? Let me illustrate this to you, which is really not another. This is Galatians 1 and verse 7. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. So what was the gospel of Christ? It was prophecy and the fulfillment of prophecy. They were saying, and I remember Hymenaeus and Philetus were saying, that the resurrection had already passed, and that upset the faith of some because their faith was in the promise of Jesus. I'm coming back in your lifetime, and when I come back, it's for judgment and the resurrection. So you've got the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection all occurring simultaneously in that event, which is exactly what 1 Corinthians 15 teaches, by the way. Now, that's why they were upset. That was the gospel of Christ. Remember, Revelation 19:10. The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. The testimony that Paul offered to the Thessalonians in Acts chapter 17 was the Old Testament scriptures. It was the same scriptures that the Bereans believed. The Thessalonians want to kill him over it. The Bereans accepted it. So there you go. Now, the idea here is, and this is what I want to show you from Galatians. So from the book of Galatians, the apostasy or their departure from the gospel was this erroneous teaching on the resurrection. So there were some who were disturbing them and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so say I now again, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you have received, he is to be accursed. Now, notice this. Let's keep looking. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? He's saying, I don't care what men say. I'm just doing what God says, and I'm preaching and teaching what God says. And this is where Christians and the Church of Christ has got to stand up today. And when I talk about the Church of Christ, you guys need to understand something. I'm not talking about a building that has 3 words on it. I'm talking about Matthew 16:18 Church of Christ, the Lord's church. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. So he uses this terminology about being under bondage. He said, now I'm under bondage to Christ. I left the bondage of that old law for the bondage or the marriage of Christ. Verse 11. For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached to me is not according to man. Neither I received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And then he goes on here to talk about his former life, how he was in the law, and he was extremely zealous for the law. But then he says, but God set me apart, verse 15, in my mother's womb, and called me through his grace, and was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Now, what he was doing was leaving that old law, and then he was going back, or going forward to the new. Now, the issue here, through the context of Galatians, is leaving the teaching of the old law behind. In chapter 2, he talks about this council at Jerusalem. What was that about? It was about the Gentiles being Judaized. Right? You see the theme developing here? So he talks about this, and he talks about these false brethren that had come in. They wanted to keep them in bondage in verse 4. And he says, verse 7, on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised. And he goes on and talks about that. So that's the idea. By the time you get to chapter 4, now you can't tell me that they were, that chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all different, and 6 are a different context than chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. No, this is all the same thing. He's developing the idea. By the time you get to chapter 4, he talks about now you are in Christ. Why would you want to go and be under that bondage? And then later in the chapter, he says, listen, get your Bibles out. We're going to go back to that old law. I'm going to show you that you do not need to go back to that, because you are now children of, not of Hagar, but you're children of the present Jerusalem, of Sarah, right? Look at this. Verse 25. Now this Hagar is Galatians 4 and verse 25. Lost my place. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free. He says, are you following Hagar, which represents the present Jerusalem? They were still in bondage. The old law was still in effect. And these Galatian brethren were listening to these Judaizing teachers that were teaching these things of the law. One of the things that of the law was the teaching on resurrection. From Ezekiel chapter 37, it was often erroneously taught in the first century. Not everybody believed this, but I think it was a very prominent belief, that there would be a resurrection that takes place of the whole house of Israel, and then they would go around and they would just destroy all the nations and all the kingdoms, and Jesus, Messiah, would sit on a physical throne in the temple and so forth. And they were teaching that. That's the same teaching, by the way, that the early church fathers embraced, perpetuating the Jewish mythology and the Jewish lie. That's why they had to have a third coming. They just compromised with the Jewish error. Why on earth they would do that? I don't know. Why not just stand up for Jesus and his promises? But they did it, and people are still perpetuating that today. Now, so in the 4th chapter, you see him telling them, listen, you can either be a part of this present Jerusalem, which is death and which is bondage, or you can be a part of the Jerusalem above, which is free. She is our mother, verse 26. And he says, it's written, rejoice, barren woman who does not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor, for more numerous are the children of the desolate than the one who has a husband. In other words, he's saying, more numerous are the children of the one who had no children. Do you get that? That's us. We're a part of that, this new Jerusalem. And that's on and on and on for all of eternity. Now also, you've got verse 28. And brethren, and you brethren, like Isaac, are children of promise. Now there again is that prolepsis we talked about. You're children of promise. And then I guess you could go through the rest of Galatians and see the idea. So when JR says let me transition back to this here. I appreciate all of you who are watching so late. I can only do this stuff when I have the time. When he says that it cannot simply be a matter of opinion, I agree with him. His opinion is wrong. He is not basing it on biblical fact, and he's taking Galatians 1:6-9 totally out of context. They were following the things of the law. They were following this resurrection, the erroneous resurrection on the teaching of the Jews. They were following Sheol. People today who teach that you go to Sheol, or that you go to Hades when you die, are still following teachings of the Old Covenant. They haven't let that go. Apparently Jesus and his blood sacrifice was no stronger than the blood of bulls and goats for 1,500 years to set them free from their bondage, and rather separation from their Father, our Father. Okay, so let's listen to this next point here.
Secondly, it denies the one hope of believers. Paul points out in Ephesians 4 and verse 4, however many gods and lords and spirits there are that many hopes. We have one hope. We are saved in this hope. Romans chapter 8, verses 24 and 25. And that hope is the redemption of the body, or the resurrection of the body.
No! Really? This is so frustrating. Okay, so he says that one hope is the redemption. I probably should let that play, make sure. Yeah, I'm going to let that play. That's so frustrating. You cannot find that concept of the redemption of a physical body anywhere in the Scriptures. Period. It's not there. It's eisegeted in there. That's my new word, at least for tonight. It's literally inserted in there, and this is what they do. And they go to 1 Corinthians 15, and they want to say, this is all about the bodily physical resurrection, when in 42 through 47, it clearly says it's a spiritual resurrection. Let me let him finish saying this, and then we'll go through this one hope.
That's the hope. This denies that hope. Furthermore, it renders Pentecost.
Okay, so before we go to that, I figured he was probably pretty much done. I'm just going to do this cold. I listened to this years ago, so I thought, hey, I'll just do this cold. So let's talk about this hope. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to Ephesians. I check my feeds here, make sure everything's looking good. So we're going to go to Ephesians 4, and we're going to talk about this one hope. And then we're going to look at what he says is the bodily resurrection. Okay, so let me show you something. Again, he takes Ephesians 4 completely and totally out of context and inserts his own belief in there. So what is the hope that Ephesians 4, starting in verse 4, is talking about? If you're a member of the Church of Christ, you probably have this memorized. Ephesians 4, verse 4. There is one body and one Spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. Now, okay, what is he trying to say? What's this one hope? Well, he says it's the hope of a bodily resurrection. Let me ask a couple questions here. Now, it's okay to ask questions to answer a question because it helps the hearer to get it, right? So, what purpose is there for the believer to have a future bodily resurrection? Now, just answer that. If you have been immersed into Christ and you're baptized into Christ, you are saved. Let me illustrate this. Okay? So, look at John 11. Let me show you something here. This is John chapter 11. So, in John chapter 11, verse 23, Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this? Now let me ask you this. Is this a spiritual death that he's talking about, or is this a physical death that he's talking about? There's only one answer to this. Is it a physical death or a spiritual death? John 11, verse 26. Let me read it again. I am the resurrection. What resurrection is he talking about here? I am the resurrection and the life. Is it physical life or is it spiritual life? Physical resurrection, spiritual resurrection. Which one is it? If this is physical life that he's promising here, a bodily resurrection, then he says when you live and believe in him, you will never die. Is that physical or spiritual? Well, anyone who dies must be lost forever. Then there's nothing they can do about it. If they die physically, if that's the case, that must mean that there are no believers. Or it's a spiritual salvation. Are you saved spiritually or are you saved physically? That is the question that must be answered if you want to understand what's being discussed in Ephesians. Okay? The eternal purpose of the church is to preach and teach that gospel from John 11 and verse 26. Now let me show you this. I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit here, but Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 21. See, we have to consider the context of the letter, and we have to interlink the context of Galatians with Ephesians, with Romans, they all have to coincide with one another, or they don't fit. That's why there were so many books that were rejected from the canon of Scripture, because they didn't flow. Now, keep this handy in your brain here, because unto him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations forever and ever. Amen. Now, if you look at the footnote, it is to the age of the ages. If you look at the King James, it is rendered world without end. And King James got that right. Their translators there. And what that means is the world will not end. The church will go on. This is this is perfect congruity with Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 12. Okay? It fits perfectly with the prophecies of the Old Testament, with Isaiah's prophecies in the little apocalypse. What is that, 24 through 27? Or 29? So, what is this one hope? It is resurrection. But it's not a physical resurrection. What is this one hope? Let me read it again. There is one body, one spirit, just as you are called in one hope of your calling. If you believe that there's one Lord, and you believe that there's one faith, and you believe in this one baptism, and this one God and Father who is over all, through all, and in all, then get this. That's the hope. All of that is wrapped up in the resurrection. Now, let me illustrate this. Paul said several times throughout the book of Acts. In Acts, I really don't have time to go through all this quite the way I want to. But here's what we have to see. We have to see that in Acts chapter 20, here's what Paul said. Paul said in Acts chapter 20, verse 27, I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose or the whole counsel of God. So Paul was preaching to the Ephesians, right? The whole counsel. What was Paul's whole counsel that these Ephesians would have understood? He said, I didn't shrink from preaching to you this entire thing. Right? Now, look what the whole counsel of God is. Paul goes into the temple. He sacrifices some animals. He pays for others in this Nazirite vow. There's no question that he's following these acts of the law. There's no question about that. So they get upset with him. They seize him. They say, hey, this guy's teaching things against the law. He goes before Felix. By the way, at one point in the 23rd chapter, 22nd chapter, 21st chapter, there's just too much to cover. That's what I was saying. We see Paul, he's in favor with the Pharisees because they think he and they agree on the resurrection. And then he expounds to them about the resurrection, and then they want to kill him. Listen to this. By the time you get to chapter 24 and verse 14, Paul says in his defense before Felix, "This I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets." Now listen to this. He says, these are the things that I believe that are written in the law and the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves. Listen to this. He says, these men who accuse me now, they have a hope in the resurrection. Okay? We do not have a hope in the resurrection because it's already taken place. We have fulfillment. Fulfillment is a lot better than hope. Hope is about something that is unseen. Listen to what Paul has to say here about this. This is I was thinking it's Romans chapter 5. But, this hope that is seen is not hope at all. It's just not hope at all. I think that was Romans 5, 20. Nope, that's not what I was thinking. Oh, well, that's all right. It's too late. I should do this when I'm not tired. But either way, I just figured I would do this. So anyway, so here's the hope. I get too ahead of myself. Having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves. This is back in Romans chapter 24. That there shall certainly, according to the New American Standard, this is the word mellow, and there is about to be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. Now, how did Paul know that it was about to happen? Well, somebody got the bright idea to say, well, this is a gnomic presence. Really? It's a gnomic present? Think about that. It's a gnomic present? What is that? Where did that come from? Who made that one up? These things just kind of roam around like gnomes. They just pop up here and there. No, everything is set on an eschatological timeline. He's talking about the judgment of the just and the unjust. That is from Daniel chapter 12. That is posited at the time of the 42 months of the destruction, or the times and half a times of the destruction of Jerusalem, when the power of the holy people will be shattered. Paul knew it was coming because Jesus taught that it was coming. And he taught in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus taught in the Olivet Discourse that the resurrection would take place in their lifetime. What do you think the gathering is of these angels from the four winds? What do you think that is? This is the resurrection. What do you think it means when he says all of these things will happen to this generation? It was them, not us. 2,000 years ago nearly. So when Paul posits the resurrection taking place in the time frame of the prophets, of which Jesus was one, hey, I don't know how to help you out of that one because it's the truth. I want you to see it. So this is the resurrection. This was the hope of the resurrection. And it was going to happen in their lifetime. The resurrection of the just and the unjust. And Paul goes through that again. He does it in chapter 26. He does it in, again, at the end of Acts. So there it is. You got this idea. So what was the one hope? these guys just really get to me when he wants to say, well, it denies the one hope of believers. Then he references Romans chapter 8. So let me get over here. So in Romans chapter 8, this is verse 23, is where he's referencing. So listen to what Romans 8 and verse 23 says. He says, and not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves, groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. For in hope we have been saved. But hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance we wait eagerly for it. Okay, so I have some things to point out here. First off, yes, he took this totally out of context. He's trying to say that this is a hope of a bodily resurrection. It's not talking about that. They were waiting eagerly for this. Paul said, listen to this. So I'm just going to use his verse here. Verse 25, if we hope for what we do not see with perseverance, we wait eagerly for it. Who was waiting for this bodily resurrection? If what JR is teaching is right. Who was waiting for that? This is the reason JR will not argue about this. This is the reason he will not debate this issue. Because he knows he's had. I think he knows it. He's just protecting. Matter of fact, it's obvious that he knows it. He admitted, this is what started the whole thing, that he takes a preterist approach to some verses in the Bible. Matthew 24 is one of them. Some portions of Matthew 24. Go back and listen to the video. You can watch his video. Listen to part 1 of this series, and you'll see what I'm talking about. He sees it, guys. He sees it. He knows he can't argue against it. But anyway, let me point something out again. He said, listen to this. I'm just going to start where he started. And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons. What is the adoption as sons? Let me point this out. In Romans, the 11th chapter, he goes through this. He says, listen, Israel's not cast away, but if they had been, then there would be no way for you to be grafted in as Gentiles. So Israel's not cast away, but they're being grafted into the what? The body. He took it totally out of context. Grafted into the body of what? That was going to be called by a new name, Isaiah 65 and 66. It's something that will never fade away. Zechariah chapter 14 teaches that after this is all done and this new body appears that we're talking of, that they go up and worship continually year after year, following the feasts. Not physically. The feasts come to an end when the temple is destroyed, but they are following that final feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the 8th day celebration. That's a lot to go over right now. So, when he goes to Romans 8, he's completely and totally taking it out of context. 100%. The body that he's talking about that is groaning is going from the body of Moses, this old covenant body, the same body that Paul explained to the Galatian brethren. Remember in Galatians chapter 4, he said, let's get our Bibles out. Let's go back and talk about Abraham. Let's go to Genesis, open up there, and let's read. And he says, we're going to illustrate that you're a part, right now, you are a part of this current Jerusalem, this present Jerusalem. Was that the gospel? No, because it was going to be destroyed. It was fading away. Then he said, you are going to be transferred, essentially, into what? This new Jerusalem, this heavenly Jerusalem, which is above. What is that? That's heaven. Heaven was in the process of being opened during the 40-year transition period. So he's denying hope of heaven to believers today. We don't. He does. Okay. Let me check something here as we're going on. Okay, let's listen to this next point. Maybe we can do a little more with it before we have to close.
Pentecost, absolutely irrelevant. Pentecost is not important. 70 AD is important. Peter says that Pentecost was the beginning, Acts 11 and verse 15. It's the beginning. This doctrine says that 70 AD was the beginning. So Pentecost becomes irrelevant.
Okay. Frustrating. Pentecost becomes irrelevant. I'm going to illustrate to you that he does not know what Pentecost was all about. So we're going to have to do a little bit of study here, right? Now, in Acts chapter 2 is where we have to go. In Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, let's talk about how irrelevant Pentecost is. Wow, that's unbelievable. All that is just, it's a tactic to scare off the members of his congregation and the people who watch this and the people who automatically align with him because he's a futurist. You know, the Baptists and the Church of Christ hate each other, but when it comes to, I mean, they literally do. I know this. My father-in-law is a Baptist preacher. We get along now, but he wasn't too crazy about the idea of me dating his daughter all those years ago. Now he's very thankful for me. I think, anyway. I like him. I'm thankful for having good in-laws. But they can ally with one another over bashing us, those who believe in the words of Jesus and the very words and take him at his word. So let's see how he deals with this. Acts chapter 2. Are you ready for this? Acts chapter 2 and verse 20. He says, "The sun will be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and glorious day of the Lord shall come." Did that happen on the day of Pentecost? And who is rendering Pentecost irrelevant? It's every bit relevant to the fulfilled position of things. Actually, it's every bit relevant to those who believe that Jesus meant what he said. I'm one of those. When he said, "I'm coming back in your lifetime." That's what Peter was preaching. They have this false presupposition that the day of the Lord is a one-day, single-day event, and that it happens in the blink of an eye, and that everything is taken care of in a microsecond. That is not the case. Daniel 12 says that it is a 3.5 year event. Matthew chapter 24, Jesus quotes Daniel in that. And he says, when you see these things, these are all signs of my coming, my parousia. So how long was the destruction of Jerusalem? 3.5 years. That was the general gist of it. Revelation chapter 11 points that out very clearly, that the Gentiles will trample the city for 42 months. He said in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus said, "You will see signs of the Son of Man in heaven." So all of these signs that were taking place was to illustrate that Jesus was in heaven, ruling and reigning. If you were a Jew in the first century, that's the last thing you wanted to hear. Because most Jews rejected Jesus as Messiah. And he said, when you see the temple destroyed, you know that that's me ruling and reigning in heaven. Now, there were signs in the heavens. There were earthquakes. You can go through history. You can see that this is a time period when there were earthquakes galore. There was a thunderstorm that was so violent that happened in and around Jerusalem. Then the lightning flashing and the sounds that caused men's hearts to fail with fear because of it. There was Josephus and Tacitus both record, ready for this? Flaming chariots and soldiers in shining armor with flaming swords fighting one another in the sky above Jerusalem in 66 AD at the beginning of this thing. So, there's all of these amazing things taking place in the first century. And Jesus said, when you see all of these events, know that's me in heaven. So, Acts chapter 2, the great and terrible day of the Lord, the glorious day of the Lord shall come, he says, but not before all these things take place. You know what Peter was doing in Acts chapter 2? Repeating the Olivet Discourse by way of Joel chapter 2. Joel, and you look at the context of Joel, Joel is illustrating the great and terrible day of the Lord. Why is this such a big deal? Let's go over here and examine some of these things from Joel. Okay? I'm not going to take a whole lot of time with this because I know I'm over time. So, but in Joel, we'll just go through this real quick, and we're going to show you how he renders Pentecost irrelevant, and we do not. We believe in it. Joel is teaching chapter 1, verse 3 of Joel. Tell your sons about it, and let your sons tell their sons, and their sons the next generation. Notice what he's saying here. This isn't for the time that I'm writing. This is for a future generation. Now, when is that future generation going to be? It's going to come about at a time, chapter 2, when the trumpet is blown. Verse 1, blow a trumpet in Zion. Whenever the trumpet is blown, it's signaling judgment and resurrection. Blow a trumpet in Zion. As a matter of fact, the ancient Jews would often put a trumpet symbol on their grave markers to illustrate resurrection. The Jews understood when the trumpet blows, the resurrection takes place. So what does that mean about the seventh trumpet sounding? That's when the resurrection happens. Okay, anyway. Blow a trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble. Now listen to this. For the day of the Lord is coming. Surely it is near. When is this? When the last trumpet blows. When this trumpet blows and this trumpet sounds. Notice what this day is talking about. It's a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Joel 2 is where I'm at. As the dawn is spread over the mountains, so there is a great and mighty people. There has never been anything like it, nor will there be again after it. To the years of many generations, unto the age of the ages. This will never happen again. This only happens one time. Peter, preaching on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, quotes this. And he says, men of Israel, listen to this. This is in verse 22 of Acts 2. Listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. They knew that he had done these miracles. If you were a Jew in the first century, you knew that miracles had departed until Messiah came. And then when Messiah comes, they last for 40 years, according to Micah chapter 7. And then they depart when he returns. You didn't catch that because you're not a Jew. Let me keep reading. Verse 23. This man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. The Jews crucified Jesus using the Romans as a tool to do it. The Romans were just the hammer and the nail. But God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. Is that physical death, by the way, when Jesus was raised up? Nope. Went through this a long time ago. Not a long time ago, just earlier this week. This idea of putting an end to death is destroying death and Hades. Revelation chapter 20. Hades and death are destroyed. That's the idea. And it actually talks about this concept in the following verses. So what was Peter talking about on the day of Pentecost? When he said, and he opened up his mouth, and he started preaching in verse 16, chapter 2 of Acts. This is what was spoken of through the prophet Joel. He said, here's the prophecy. You know that these miracles have been attested to you by Jesus. You know the prophecies of the ancient prophets. You know that they're going to last for 40 years, and you know that they're going to end when Messiah comes and is reigning victorious. That does not render Pentecost irrelevant. It makes it of premier importance. Who renders Pentecost irrelevant? The hyperfuturist, who preaches and teaches that all Pentecost was about was the beginning of the church. It was a whole lot more than that. And by the way, I agree with that. But they don't. Jesus said, Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18, Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Here you go. Here you go. Ready for this? Here you go. Let me quote it again. Matthew 16 verse 18. Jesus said to Peter, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. When the church comes in its fullness and its maturity, and the bride is fully married, and we're past that time of betrothal, and the marriage takes place, and then the wedding feast takes place, guess what happens? Hades is destroyed. I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. How long does it take to build something? You lay the foundation, right? You got to pour your footer. You lay the foundation. You put your sill plates on. You build your uprights. You put the rooms in. You're going to put in insulation. You got to put out on the exterior stuff first. Then you put in wiring and insulation and drywall. And, it takes time to build this. This is what Jesus did when John chapter 14, 1 through 4. This is what Jesus did. He said, I'm going to prepare a place for you. How long did it take for him to prepare that? When it's prepared, I'll come back and get you. Is Jesus still building? Well, that's the longest construction project in the world, in the history of man. No, he built his church in the time when he said he would. Hades has been destroyed. Heaven is open. And if you are in Jesus, you are in heaven. Spiritually speaking. We'll go over this one of these days. I'll take some time about the we're in heaven now thing. Okay? There's just so much more about Acts 2 I really want to go through. However, I figured this would happen. I'm a little over on my time. Actually, I'm a lot over my time. And I still got some things I need to do for tomorrow, this being Saturday night. So, what do you know? Here we are. And I just want to thank JR Bronger for this. We're going to start next time at I need to write this down at 21:12. It looks like we're going to talk about this. Let me transition this. We're going to talk about this fourth point that he got. It totally rejects a coming day of judgment. In installment number 3, in video number 3, I'm going to prove irrefutably that he doesn't have a clue what the day of judgment is. And he's quoting John 12:48 and Acts 17:31. And I agree with both of those verses. In Acts chapter 17, there's a day appointed. Amen. But it's already passed. And people want to think that this is a one-day judgment that occurred and that took place. And yeah, I can probably go along with that. But there was a process that led up to this without question. So this is just kind of a preview of that. But there was a day appointed. I'm going to show you what that day was. We're going to go through what judgment is the next time with this. So having said that, I'm going to close this up for tonight. It's going on 11:32, and I appreciate you all being up and watching this and checking this out. Hey, I wanted to look at a couple of these comments here. Michael Adams, appreciate all your comments, by the way. Maybe we can get 5 million people listening to this. If I took my time to do this, we'd be here 3 or 4 hours. So we'll just break it up in roughly hour chunks. And this is going to be in a playlist. I'll create that playlist when I'm done here after this video on YouTube at Restoration Movement 2.0. So share this, by the way. And Rooster says, we always quoted Joel 28, but then we wouldn't read any further out of ignorance. Amen. You got that, brother. Then he quotes Joel 3:13. Put ye in the sickle. See, I didn't even get to go through all of Joel. Revelation 14:18. For the harvest is ripe. Come, get you down. For the press is full. The vats overflow. For their wickedness is great. You know something? This is just awesome stuff. I wish I had time to go through this. Peter quoted Joel, and he said, "This is the parousia, the coming of the Lord, the great and terrible day of the Lord. You're witnessing it now," which is exactly what Jesus promised Caiaphas in. Okay, I'm going to share something with you. Okay, I'm going to take a minute. Look at Matthew chapter 26. Then I promise I'm going to be done. But I'm hyped about this. Matthew 26, verse 64. They think they got us on this, so let them answer this one. Matthew chapter 26, verse 64. Jesus said, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." So Jesus looks at Caiaphas and he says, "You will see me coming on the clouds of heaven." Okay? Is this tough to answer or not? No, it's not. Let me illustrate this to you. Get your phone out. You can do this right now, or we'll just do it sometime. So get your phone out. Matter of fact, let me see if I can do this. Hey Siri, when did Caiaphas die?
Caiaphas died in 100.
Ah, that's not what I wanted. Well, if you look it up, if you type it in, let me see if I can do it here. When did Caiaphas die? Is he? I don't think 100 is right either. Let me see what it says. Okay, so if you can see this, I'll hold this up here. Okay, it says Google says that Caiaphas died in 36 AD. So these guys got the bright idea to do Google eschatology, right? So what they have done is they've said, well, Caiaphas died in 36, so the Lord couldn't have returned in his lifetime. That's not true. So where do you get that Caiaphas died in 36? Google? Google doesn't give you that information. Matter of fact, there's nowhere in history that gives you that information. First off, let me point out, when Jesus spoke to Caiaphas, he was speaking to the entire Sanhedrin. Listen to this. Verse 57 of Matthew 26. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the elders and the scribes and the elders were gathered together. So Caiaphas, the scribes and the elders, this was all of the chief priests. Verse 59. The chief priests and the whole council were there. So he wasn't only addressing Caiaphas, he was addressing Caiaphas like you would address the chief justice of the Supreme Court. But they're all listening, they're all there partaking, and they're all getting that information. So that was very similar to that. Now, history does not teach when Caiaphas died, but it does give 3 options. The first of which is that Caiaphas died being taken prisoner on a trip to Rome to answer for his treachery or whatever, I don't know. And he died mid-trip. This is what history says. And so they were going to bury him, and they dug a hole, they threw his body in there, and the earth spit his body out because he was so evil and wicked and corrupt. Well, that's easily debunked. And nobody believes that that's actually the case. Well, I guess there are some. So you're going to have to choose that. But we don't know when that would have been. It's just kind of a legend. The second one says that Caiaphas became Josephus. Just changed names and was a turncoat and became Josephus. And then would have died after the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, there's no historical evidence for that. Again, just legend. The third one, and I think the most plausible, is that he, being a high priest, would have died in 68, being rounded up by the Idumeans. I think it was the Idumeans. And they came in and they took every high priest and slaughtered them. Now, this is the most likely scenario. And that puts Caiaphas dying after seeing Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven. This statement where Jesus said, "You're going to see me coming in the glory of my Father on the clouds of heaven." That happened when? When did those chariots come in the sky and all of these signs and Jerusalem being surrounded? When did Caiaphas, all those things take place? Started in 66. Caiaphas, if he was one of those, which is the most likely scenario, wouldn't have died until 68. He would have witnessed those things. He would have saw the coming of Jesus. Aha, answer that one. So, their Google exegesis just simply does not work. Okay, I'm going to call it quits now that I'm an hour and 16 minutes. I love all of you all. I'm going to do another one of these videos before too long. I don't know when. Just whenever the Spirit moves me, so to speak. And hey, we'll just do it the next time. And be looking forward to you joining me then. And JR, if you're watching this or anyone who knows JR, send him a copy of this. Copy the link, send it to him so he can watch these things and give him some information so he can prepare for our debate. We haven't set the time yet. As a matter of fact, he hasn't even accepted this. And I have a feeling he probably won't. But he called me a coward. And we'll just see how all that turns out. All right, there we go. Love y'all, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching. If you're just joining us, go back and watch the rest of this video. I think it'll be interesting for you to hear some of these things. And listen, Jesus proves that he's Messiah by fulfilled prophecy. If all prophecy hasn't been fulfilled, he's not Messiah and salvation hasn't come. We're preaching that salvation has come in Jesus Christ. Those who live and believe in him shall never die. John 11 and verse 26. They'll never die. That's salvation. You have to be in Christ in order to have that. And the only way to do that is to be added to him by being buried with him, being immersed with him in baptism. Okay, that's it. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.